On this episode of the Scientific Investor Podcast, we're exploring the psychology of money and investing. We'll be finding out how to achieve better investment returns by applying a few simple rules.
We want to believe in our own greatness and that our own effort can add value. But money management is just one of those places where simple rules tend to beat human discretion and sort of in the moment decision making again and again.
Why having an advisor who can act as a behavioral coach can make all the difference.
Most people seek out an advisor because they think they're going to get some stock picking wizard. That is simply not the case. What you're going to get is a decisional guide who's going to protect you from your worst impulses.
And why your money needs a why.
This idea that we can just make everything a little more purposeful and that we can bring purpose to work, that we can bring purpose home, and even bring purpose to something as crass as our money is, I think, a powerful conceit that's not talked about a lot and one that I hope people will chew on.
Our guest is Dr. Daniel Crosby. Daniel is a psychologist and an expert in behavioral finance. He's the author of several books, the latest being The Soul of Wealth, published by Harriman House. He's a husband and father of three, and he lives in Alpharetta, Georgia. If you want to be a successful investor, understanding basic psychology and really knowing yourself are essential. But accumulating money is pointless if you don't have a purpose to go with it. So for some people, this episode is a potential game changer. Here then is my interview with Dr. Daniel Crosby. So Daniel, tell me how your interest in the psychology of money, if I can use that phrase, began.
I was lucky to grow up in a household where we talked about money around the dinner table. My dad is a financial advisor. And so I think unlike a lot of folks, at least in the US, I grew up with sort of a deep financial literacy and a deep comfort talking about money. But I was also lucky to grow up in a household where I think my parents put first things first. And even though my dad was a financial advisor, he was also equally clear in helping me understand what money could and couldn't do. So yeah, I think it really all stems back to childhood, growing up in a home where money was discussed, but meaning and purpose and living a good life were also very, very top of mind.
You studied psychology at university. So how did you end up focusing on money specifically?
The quick answer is that I burned out. I went to school. I'm a clinical psychologist by education. My PhD is in clinical psychology. But a few years into doing that full time, I started at the ripe old age of 23, Robin, which is a funny time in life to be dispensing life advice to other people when you're 23 years old. But I just burned out, 40 to 50 hours a week of talking to people about really heavy life subjects proved to be too much for me. And so I knew that I wanted to think deeply about why people do the things that they do. I knew that I loved studying human behavior, but I also knew that I didn't want to do it in a medical or a clinical context. And so again, through my talking to my father about this career conundrum I was having, he said, "Look, there's a ton of psychology in my world of personal finance. Maybe you should look into that." And it's funny because this is, 17 years ago. My father did not know the words behavioral finance or behavioral economics, but he knew that there was psychology in the world of wealth management and finance. And his simple comment put me on a path of exploration that led me to Dan Ariely and Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler and many of the other folks who were doing work in that area, and to fall in love with it.
We're going to talk shortly about your new book, The Soul of Wealth. It's your third book, though. The first, published in 2016, is called The Laws of Wealth. And one of the key messages contained in that book is that, when it comes to money and investing in particular, it's important to focus on things within our control. Now, why is that?
Well, it's when people learn that I work in finance, I reliably get a couple of questions. I get questions that are almost universally about predicting the future, and I get questions that are almost always out of people's power to control. So I'll get questions like, what will the president do or the prime minister do? What will happen with the spread of the virus? What will happen with this war? What will the Fed do? With interest rates. And it's interesting that people tend to be so fixated on these things because one, they're of course unknowable. And then two, they're uncontrollable. So it leads to this real sense of learned helplessness. And in the book, my very first chapter is called You Control What Matters Most. And it's based on this research that you have done an excellent job of disseminating, which is that the things that matter to you crossing your financial finish line are things like remaining long term in your outlook, being patient, being well behaved, maximizing your own human capital and maximizing that engine of your wealth. So people really need to take that power back to own this fact that we control the most important variables in our financial lives and leave the worrying about the unknowables to other folks.
Another takeaway from your first book is that trouble is opportunity. In other words, you can, if you like, gain an edge over other investors by sort of just staying calm after market downturns, and perhaps even seeing them as buying opportunities. But as a psychologist, you know better than anyone that that's really hard to do in practice. What advice can you give to investors about that?
Yeah, it's true, Robin. One of the things that is a hallmark of humankind is that we tend to project the recent past into the future indefinitely. The shrink term for this is recency bias, but basically, like whatever's happening right now, we think will happen in perpetuity. And in markets, almost the opposite is the truth. One of the things that I talk about in the laws of wealth is that the truest words in investing are "this too shall pass." So if we look at a really good year like this year, the idea that this too shall pass can sort of humble us or chasten us or manage our expectations. And if we go back to March of 2020 or March of 2009, when we're in the throes of a very bad market, the idea that this too shall pass can embolden us and give us strength and give us hope. So the first thing I would say is to get that mentality right and to understand that this too shall pass is the truest thing you could ever say about any market, good or bad. The second thing I would say is you have to be a little bit of a market historian. Because if we look back over the last 35 years, the average intra year drawdown, so the peak to trough drawdown in any given year, has been about 15%. So we get a market correction just about as regularly as you get, your birthday or Christmas or Hanukkah, right? It's very, very regular how much these things happen. And yet the financial news media talks about them as if they've never happened before and as though it's the end of the world every time it happens. So you have to just understand that you're probably going to get a 10% dip every year. You're probably going to get a 20% dip every couple of years. And every decade or so, you're going to get a really nasty 30 to 50% dip in the markets. And understanding that and inoculating yourself against that volatility on the front end, I think is a good way to prepare for it. Once you've got sort of the right mindset, I think there's also two practical steps that you can take. The first is to automate your contributions, to automate the way that you save and invest and your money. One of the things that I love about this is it takes a human tendency to be status quo prone, sort of lazy and forgetful. And it actually allows us to use our status quo proneness, our laziness, and our forgetfulness to our own benefit. Because if we set it and forget it, if we set a good program of saving and investing in place, and leave it alone, which we are very prone to do, we can actually make that work for our benefit. So getting the right mindset's critical, automating good behavior wherever we can. And then if you need further help, working with someone, working with an advisor who can help you can also be a good strategy.
One of my favorite quotes from The Laws of Wealth is this: um, exceptional investing over a lifetime cannot be predicated on luck. It must be grounded in a systematic approach. Give us an idea of what you think a systematic approach looks like.
Yeah, Robin, one of the things that people get wrong most is thinking that human genius, human intervention, and human discretion can be additive to our financial lives. And we see that almost universally they are reductive and not additive. We want to believe in our own greatness and that our own effort can add value, but money management is just one of those places where simple rules tend to beat human discretion and sort of in the moment decision making again and again. And we see this over 90% of the time in contexts where humans are involved. It's almost always better to follow simple rules. When it comes to things like prison recidivism, like if a panel is trying to predict, who should go free and who should remain in jail, following simple rules is 4 times as effective as trying to make a judgment call about whether this person has found God or feels sorry for their sins, right? The same thing is true with our money. Because the thing that happens is the emotions of a moment tend to color our perception, and that emotional contagion tends to color and impact negatively the way we see risk or the way we make decisions in a moment. So it is almost universally better to systematize a process. It's also usually cheaper, and it allows you to go do more important things like read a book, watch a soccer game, or play with your kids.
Now, you're a psychologist, but a fundamental point that you make in your second book, The Behavioral Investor, published in 2018, is that actually investor behavior is not just about psychology. It's about biology, it's about neurology, and indeed sociology. It's no wonder, is it then, that this whole subject of behavioral investing, if you like, is so fascinating and also so complicated.
It is. I was proud to write that book because I saw a huge gap. We were mostly talking about the psychology, but the neurology, the physiology, all of that has a role to play. More than anything, the thing that makes us human is our ability to cooperate. And many of the things that we refer to as behavioral biases are really just things that are neither good nor bad, that are tendencies about human nature. And one of these is this tendency to cooperate. The tendency to cooperate and work together is what allows us to build great churches, cultures, cities, civilizations. But it's also one that causes us to rely too heavily on the crowd, on the herd, and what other people think when it comes to making decisions. I cite research in there that shows that when other people have a divergent opinion from us, it actually changes in our brain the way we sense and perceive the world around us. So, in the most literal means possible, peer pressure isn't just a psychological force, it is actually a perceptual force that changes the way that we see the world. And until we understand just how connected we are and how wired we are for groupthink, it becomes hard to get it right with our money.
So, if investor behavior involves all of these different elements, how can investors ensure, if you like, that they're physically and mentally fit enough to handle inevitable setbacks and volatility?
Well, there's sort of two layers here. The first is self-care becomes a material consideration when we're talking about managing our money and thinking about our financial lives. I know we're going to talk about the soul of wealth in a minute, but we found in the soul of wealth that people who go to the gym every day or 5 times a week make more money than people same education peers who don't. People who go to therapy, men who go to therapy, make 12% more than same education peers who don't. So, taking care of yourself, getting enough rest, going to therapy, going to the gym, eating healthy food, all of these things that we consider part of a wellness routine are an underappreciated part of a financial wellness routine. So that would be one sort of takeaway for me. The other thing I would say, though, is we want to divest ourselves of this as thoroughly as possible. One of the favorite studies from the behavioral investor that I'll never forget looked at the excitatory power different types of stimuli have in the brain. So they would show people all the good stuff, like all the stuff you're not supposed to talk about at a in polite company, sex, death, religion, politics, all the sort of spicy topics. And they would measure the excitatory power of these stimuli in the brain. And the one that had the most power was actually money. More than sex, more than death, more than religion, more than politics, it was money that excited our cognition. And so, understanding how sort of bent out of shape we become about money, I think it is a recipe for offloading it, either working with an advisor or fully or nearly fully automating the process by which we save, spend, and invest is one of the best things we can do because the less we think about it, the less bent out of shape we're going to be.
Another crucial point you make in the behavioral investor is that having a financial advisor who can act as a behavioral coach can be really valuable. Well, why do you say that? And what do you mean exactly by a behavioral coach?
Great question, because the thing that advisors do best is not the thing that most people are looking for when they hire an advisor. So it's a very sort of a strange disconnect. Merrill Lynch did a meta analysis. So this is a study of all the studies on advisor value add in 2016. And I took that study and I averaged out all the results. And they found, first of all, everything that an advisor does for her clients is additive. But things like fund selection were just a little additive. They added about a third of a point, about a third of a percentage point of value per year. Same thing with like tax management strategies, added about one third of a point of value per year. But if you looked at what we would call behavioral coaching, which is keeping that person out of their own way, preventing them from making a giant mistake, preventing an emotional contagion from wrecking the way that they go to market, that added nearly 2.5% per year of added value. So it's about 8 times as additive. So most people seek out an advisor because they think they're going to get some stock picking wizard. That is simply not the case. What you're going to get is a decisional guide who's going to protect you from your worst impulses. And while that may not sound as sexy as putting you in the next high flying stock, it is dramatically more valuable empirically.
I quite agree, Daniel. And in my experience, although advisors are generally becoming more aware of the sorts of behavioral issues we're talking about here, and that's the good news. The bad news is that some of them take behavioral coaching less seriously than others, and some, frankly, are not particularly good at it. If someone's choosing an advisor and they agreeing with you and they're saying, yeah, Daniel's right, I need somebody to help me with behavioral coaching. What sort of questions do they need to be asking?
I'll give you one question to ask and one thing to look for. So, the place where I went to university was sort of known for one stream of research in particular, and it was around what we call psychotherapeutic outcomes, which is just a fancy way of saying when someone goes to therapy, do they get better or not, and why? When you look at someone who is going to see a psychologist, the number one predictor of whether or not they get better is the level of rapport between that therapist and that client. The number of years of education is negligible. The particular approach is negligible. It really comes down to, is there mutual respect? Is there mutual liking? And do you like this person you're sat across from enough to take the hard advice that they're giving you about how to improve your life? The same thing absolutely applies to advisors. I don't think that most people would do what we might call colloquially a vibe check when they go to see their advisor, but I think that is exactly what should happen. Do you like them? Because the things that they are going to ask you are very difficult. We are wired to spend. We are wired to take bad risks. We are wired for immediacy. And an advisor is going to ask you to be prudent, to be long term, to save, to do all of these things that are psychically very, very painful. And the only way that you're going to get the maximum benefit out of that advisory relationship is if you like the person that is sitting across from you. So the number one thing I would look for is what we might call rapport. The question that I would ask, because the evidence backs this up, is what specific steps will you take to keep me from being my own worst enemy? And I would look for specificity here, not hand waving about, taking good care of you or something like that. I would look for absolute specificity around an advisor who has been thoughtful about the way that she or he goes to market as a behavioral coach.
Hi, I'm Mark Hebner, and thank you for watching or listening to Scientific Investor, which is brought to you by Index Fund Advisors. When I founded IFA.com 25 years ago, one of my goals was to educate people about how financial markets work. I wanted them to stop speculating and start investing, and that remains an important part of my mission today. You'll find a wealth of high-quality content on our website, on our app, in my book, and on our YouTube channel. Please take a look and share our videos and articles with others you think would benefit. And together, we can help change the way the world invests.
Your latest book, Daniel, has recently been published by Harriman House, and it's called The Soul of Wealth, 50 Reflections on Money and Meaning. Essentially, it's a collection of 50 short essays, and there are elements, I suppose, of psychology and sort of even sort of spirituality to it, if you like. This is a huge question, but for you, what does it truly mean to be wealthy?
For me, your mileage will vary, but for me, there's really two things for me. One is to leave a legacy of being a wonderful husband and a father, and secondarily to leave an intellectual legacy. Those are the two things that I'm trying to do. Those are my two big rocks. I want to leave my family better than I found it, and I want to leave the world wiser than I found it. And those are sort of the two things that I strive for.
You explain in your introduction how humankind finds itself at a strange crossroads, and you write this: "We know intuitively that true wealth is about far more than mere money. Yet far too often we act as though money is an end unto itself, sacrificing some of the richest parts of our lives in its pursuit." Why do you think that is?
It certainly has been a persistent issue for all of humankind, but I think it's heightened in the era we live in now. So when the U.S. was founded, right, 250-ish years ago, when the U.S. was founded, 85% of the world was living in poverty. So what today would be $2 or less a day. And if you think about that, 250 years ago in the broad scope of the human timeline is a very, very short moment at all. And so for most of human history, we have just been backbreakingly poor. And most people have been just trying to get by. Today, that number sits at about 8.5 to 9% of the world is living on $2 per less a day, which is still too many folks in pain and struggling, but is so much better than it has been throughout time. So the middle class has grown around the world in unprecedented ways. And increasingly, we have those bottom two rungs of Maslow's famous hierarchy knocked out. We have, we're eating 2,000 calories a day. We have a warm place to sleep and a roof over our heads. And yet, we see that people are more disconnected now than they have ever been. Suicide rates are climbing. The UK, a few years ago, appointed what sounds very Orwellian, a minister of loneliness, because loneliness had become so problematic in the UK. Here in the US, people my age and younger, a majority of people my age and younger say that they are lonely. Among US males, the modal number of close friends they have is 0. And so we live in this time when we have more abundance than we've ever had. And yet we have this spiritual, existential, psychological poverty. And so the book is all about trying to bridge that gap. And some of that impoverishment comes from treating money as the end all be all, comes from treating money as liquid happiness and the only thing that matters. And money it's easy to do that because money is easy to measure. It's easy to count, to stack. If you figure it out, it's easy to make. It's easy to quantify our lives that way. It's very much harder to quantify the things in life that matter. I mean, you ask me a very poignant question about what matters to me. I can measure the money in my bank account much more easily than I can measure my children's love. And I think because of that, we sort of default to money and leave more reliable paths to joy on the table.
Now, your book contains so many useful insights, but I'll just pick out a few that really resonated with me. And one of those insights is that how we spend our money reveals what's important to us. It reveals our values, if you like. Explain what you mean by that.
There's a couple of chapters on this, and it's a wonderful question. For whatever reason, not as many people have asked me about this as I would have liked. So I appreciate you bringing it to the fore. One of the things that you first learn about humankind when you start to study human behavior is that we are massively self-deceived. That the way that we account for why we do the things we do and why we actually do the things we do sometimes doesn't have a whole lot in common. And so we're always looking for royal roads to insight into why we do the things that we do. And money, I suggest in one chapter, is a very clear descriptor of your values. There are many people that say that they value health who spend a lot of money on fast food and very little money on personal trainers. There's very many people who say they value spirituality, who spend very little money on tithing or self-help books or personal growth or therapy. So I think money is this ultimate BS indicator that allows us to call ourselves on our own nonsense and our own self-deception. A related concept is that spending money is a form of voting. If you look at the most powerful human and civil rights movements in history, almost all of them have had financial and economic levers. The bus boycott in the Deep South in my home state of Alabama during the U.S. struggle for civil rights, the bus boycott in Montgomery was central to that. If you look at the eradication of apartheid in South Africa, divesting from sporting events with South African teams and divesting from diamond mines and other things in South Africa was a central way by which world powers brought about the world that they wanted to see. We do the same thing every day when we spend our money. We are voting every time we spend a pound or a dollar. We are voting for the world that we want to exist. And I don't know that we're always doing that very consciously.
And for me, Daniel, this is a real reason for using a financial planner. As you were saying earlier, people have the impression that an advisor is there to give you investment advice, but a really crucial part of their work, as far as I'm concerned, as well as behavioral coaching, is financial planning. And part of that is kind of aligning your values, if you like, with your spending and indeed with your investing as well. Um, do you see that as the important role of an advisor?
I absolutely do, and I think there's two-part benefits to this. There's socially responsible or values-based investing, where you can, in a very real sense, align, your money with your values, and that has, on one level, it has an impact on the world, right? Because if people start to invest in a certain way, and we're divesting of this and putting money into green energy, then that has a material impact on the world. But it also has, from my seat, a material impact on behavior. Because what we see is, imagine a bear market, a 25% dip in the market, and someone is sat looking at two different funds they have. One is the Women's Leadership Fund that invests in companies that have equal 50% or greater representation of women on their boards. Right, that might be deeply meaningful to them. And the other fund is a FTSE fund or an S&P 500 fund. Well, there's no real attachment to the FTSE or to the S&P 500 the way there is to the Green Energy Fund or the Women's Leadership Fund or the Plowshares Fund that doesn't invest in weapons. And so I do think that not only can investing in values-based ways do something to bring about the world you want, I think it can also bring about good behavior and make financial markets seem like less of a video game and more like what they actually are, which is partial ownership of businesses that do real good and real bad in the world.
That's really well put. Another question you explore in the book is, that old chestnut: can money buy you happiness? Now, it is fair to say that experts who've researched this topic, and many have, they have mixed opinions on it, don't they? That's fair to say, isn't it?
That is, I'm going to mess up the name of my own chapter, but I think the chapter title is something like "Money Can Kind of Sort of Buy You Happiness Sometimes If You Spend It Right." And, that sort of reflects the research. So, quickly, a few years ago, many years ago at this point, there was research that showed that at about $75,000 US, happiness started to plateau. And after about $75,000 US, which would be about 100,000 today, that happiness really plateaued. And people like me were excited about that finding because it said, "Oh, look, you really can't buy happiness." But it turns out that it's a little more complicated than that, because what they were measuring, there's no blood test for happiness, of course. So what they were measuring in that study was more the absence of pain, perhaps more so than joy or happiness. And it is true that money can buy you freedom from pain. It can take you to the doctor, it can fix your leaky roof, it can warm your drafty house. So there is some freedom from pain that comes with money, which is no small good. But we also now see that subjectively, people who are asked to describe their lives qualitatively, to just say, "Hey, Robin, how are you doing? Write me an essay on how are you doing." We find that people who describe their lives qualitatively or subjectively, they see an increase in happiness up to very, very high levels of income, $500,000 a year, which would, put you well into the 1% of top earners in my home country. So it matters how we measure happiness. I also showed in the book that about 15% of people are just impervious to money when it comes to happiness. So their sadness is the impact of something larger. Could be organic or genetic considerations. It could be traumas or negative personal experiences. And so chasing money, if you're one of that 15%, chasing money is not going to help you much. And then the last thing, that I talk about in the book is ways that you can spend money to make you happy, because that matters. Not all routes of spending money are the same. And it turns out there definitely are some ways of spending your money that make you happier than others.
Absolutely. What other insights have academics come up with about how to spend money to maximize your happiness and well-being?
Yeah, so experiences over stuff is well understood. That is definitely the case. Giving away money is one that people really misapprehend and don't understand the power of. Being charitable is dramatically increases happiness. Spending money on getting out of work you hate is another one of my favorite routes to happiness. I joke that I will never cut my yard again. I will never mow my grass again because I live in a warm part of the U.S. and it's hot outside and there's bugs and I don't want to do it. So, letting that high school kid cut my lawn instead of me is a big happiness booster in my life. And then the last thing that I would say, if you're going to buy stuff, there's sort of interesting research that shows if you're going to buy stuff that deepens relationships. So people who buy a car, say, see a very limited and a very brief uptick in happiness because you buy that car for a few weeks, it's new, it's shiny, it smells nice, and then quickly it just becomes the way you get your groceries and the way you take your kids to school. If you buy a car to be part of a car club, though, there's actually a great deal of happiness that comes with that because you've bought yourself some new friends, you've bought yourself relationships, you've bought yourself something to do on Saturday morning. And so spending in ways that deepen relationships, whether that's, a hobby that brings people together, whether that's a trip, whatever that may be, is a powerful good.
This is a great example of a book you can dip in and out of. And I'm intrigued by the title of one of the chapters I hadn't yet read, Willpower is Overrated. What's all that about?
One of the things that we think about when we think about financial well-being is willpower. And it seems like some people just have a preternatural ability to be calm, be centered, be thoughtful, and be prudent with their wealth, and that others are sort of necessarily reckless. And so I wanted to dig into the research on willpower and see if it was as simple as all that. And it turns out that it's not, that it is not that some people just have, this unbelievable grit and this ability to white knuckle their way past financial temptation. There's really two things at play. The people who exhibit the highest levels of willpower, on the first hand, they have made their behavior habitual. So they don't even think about it anymore. It's not as if they're willing their way to do something. It's not as if they're drawing on deep reservoirs of inner strength. It's just a thing that they do now. So whether it be through repetition or automation, they have just made good behavior habitual. That is hallmark number one. Hallmark number two is that they do an excellent job of staying out of the way of temptation. My beloved wife, who is one of the least the least spendy people you would ever meet. She's very frugal. She's very good with money. And one of the ways that she manages that is by staying out of shopping malls. She knows she likes to shop. She knows she likes nice things. And she knows that if she goes to a shopping center, she will want to buy the nice things there. And so she doesn't go at all. This year, I have lost a great deal of weight. And one of the ways that I have done that is by keeping cookies out of my house. Because there's very few of us who can see the Oreos and pass them up when they're right in front of us. It is much easier to make sure that the Oreos never make it through the doorway in the first place. So those are really the two hallmarks of good willpower. It's habitual behavior, making good behaviors habitual, and making bad behaviors hard.
As a financial educator specializing in investing, My experience is that the biggest mistakes investors make tend to involve risk. Now, you talk in the book about the importance of understanding what you call the three dimensions of risk. What are those?
So there's three dimensions of risk, and we use imprecise language as an industry when we talk about these things, and it gets to be problematic. So the first dimension of risk is what we call risk tolerance. And most people conflate the term risk tolerance for being risk-taking behavior in aggregate, and it's not that. So risk tolerance is your sort of innate natural comfort with making trade-offs between risk and reward. And it actually tends to be very stable over a lifetime. It tends to be pretty static over a lifetime. Next, we have risk capacity. Your capacity to take risk depends on things like your age, your level of wealth, and your goals. So, someone like Warren Buffett has a lot more risk capacity than I do, because if he loses half of his wealth, he is still quite good because he would still have billions of dollars and not many years to live. I'm half his age and I've got young children at home and a lot less money. And so I can't afford to play as fast and loose with my money as he can. So age, wealth, and the size of your ambitions sort of determine your capacity to take risk. The final piece is the psychological element that is often referred to as risk composure. And this is your level of emotional stability or lability. This is how easily your short-term emotional reaction is how likely it is to dislocate your longer-term preferences. So to put a finer point on that, in March of 2020, if you are calling your advisor and saying, the world is going to hell, the virus is spreading, sell everything, like I don't want to be in the markets anymore. If I called a timeout, like if I froze frame right there and said, Robin, is the call you just made, is that prudent? Is that what you should be doing? Right? You would probably say to me, no. Like I know I shouldn't be doing that. That's your risk tolerance speaking. Look, your long-term sort of thoughtful brain is saying, no, I shouldn't be doing this. But if you're emotionally unstable, if you're emotionally reactive, the heat of that moment has impelled you to make that call. So all three measures, we need to know about all three measures. We need to know about the hot, the cool, and the capability. And so all three of those measures are material, all three of those matter, and they're candidly very seldom studied and assessed in concert. So a lot of times we'll know about one, sometimes two. It's not very often that institutions or advisors will measure all three, but the ones who do a great job.
I have to say, my favorite chapter in your book is the last one entitled No One Gets Rich Alone. Of course, most wealthy people who weren't born wealthy have achieved what they have mainly through hard work. But we all need to acknowledge, don't we, the role of luck in our lives, and the part that other people have played in our success.
It's a huge point, and it's one about which people can get sort of unnecessarily testy, because everyone wants to think that if they've been successful, that was entirely owing to their own merits. And the case that I try to make there is a nuanced one, and it's always dangerous to try and be nuanced online and in writing. But it's that yes, if you've made it, right, if you've made it financially, undoubtedly, some of that has to do with your personal grit and effort and genius, and no one should try and take that away, right? But if you've made it, I think it's also behooves people to understand the role of luck or providence or good fortune in that, and to try and send the elevator back down for people who are less fortunate. And that would tie back to many of the other chapters in the book about gratitude and giving. Robin, when I think about my own career, I am someone who was floundering. We talked about it earlier. I was sort of lost. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I didn't know how I wanted to apply my education. The good advice I got from my father pointed me in a good direction. Okay. He then passed me a referral who opened the first door for me to get into this industry. Now, he opened the door. I still had to walk through it. I still had to be competent and capable and write the books and do the research. But there's no telling if I would have even had a door to walk through had it not been opened by someone in my life. So you can acknowledge that without taking anything away from yourself. And that's what I hope people will learn from that chapter is it's not about debasing yourself. It's not about tearing yourself down or making yourself small or humbling yourself even. It's about understanding the role other people and good fortune have played in your own success and then trying to help other people get more of the same.
I love that notion of, when you get to the top, send the elevator down for the next person. Finally, Daniel, it's been a really fascinating conversation. If there's one thing you'd like people to take away from what we've been discussing, what would it be?
Yeah, I hope they'll read the chapter on Your Money Needs a Why. All of this book is about money and meaning. And when we start to imbue our lives with meaning, when we start to weave this golden thread of meaning through every part of our lives, it elevates all of our endeavors. It elevates our work, as you'll read about in one chapter. It elevates the way that we manage our money and think about our own financial planning. So this idea that we can just make everything a little more purposeful and that we can bring purpose to work, that we can bring purpose home and even bring purpose to something as crass as our money is, I think, a powerful conceit that's not talked about a lot and one that I hope people will chew on.
You've written another really outstanding book, which I'm sure readers will find hugely insightful. Thank you so much for your time. That was my interview with the psychologist and expert in behavioral finance, Dr. Daniel Crosby. A reminder that his latest book is called The Soul of Wealth, and it's published by Harriman House. Thank you to Daniel and to Index Fund Advisors for supporting the Scientific Investor podcast. You'll find a wide range of high-quality articles, charts, and videos on the IFA website at ifa.com. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe? We would also love to receive your comments. Until next time, goodbye.